Hello, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Assam, and I'm a second-year student here at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. I also am one of the several coordinators who's worked very hard in planning this event. If you're not already aware, this event is the kickoff event for the Perspectives in World War II Symposium. I hope that each of you at this time have a flyer with the Perspective Symposium on it, and I encourage each of you to attend as many events as you can that are going to be going on this week. The Perspective Symposium has been a collaborative event between several groups on our campus. The Holocaust and World War II were tragic events that impacted almost every aspect of society, and the effects and the consequences of both are still felt today. Our aim with the symposium is to shed light on narratives that aren't always heard. The symposium also presents the opportunity to have conversations that are sometimes difficult but very necessary to have. And I think that that's what's going to happen today. We're going to have a conversation that may be a little difficult but is absolutely necessary to have. The format of today's talk will be 15 minutes with Professor Dr. El-Kati, followed by 15 minutes for Dr. Kim Vrudny. After that, there will be a response period where they have the opportunity to respond to one another. And I ask that during that response period, if you have any questions or comments, that you write it down on the green response cards that will be going around the room. Sean and Professor Schultz will collect those. And then at the end of this event, there'll be a Q&A session where I'll take those questions and ask our panelists. Before I get into our introductions, I really want to thank every student that's been a part of planning the symposium. I also would really like to thank the Terrence Murphy Institute, the program coordinator Sean Harris, Professor Elizabeth Schultz, and the Black Law Students Association. So, Dr. Mohammed El-Kati is a professor emeritus of history. Mahmoud El-Kati, I'm sorry, Professor, at Malacaster College in St. Paul, where the Mahmoud El-Kati Distinguished Lectureship in American Studies was established in recognition of his scholarly work and contributions. He is a lecturer, a writer, and a commentator on the African American experience. Dr. Kimberly Vrudny is an associate professor of systematic theology at the University of St. Thomas, where she has been on the faculty since 2001, and she teaches in the areas of theology, in the arts, and theological aesthetics. Her current work involves researching works of protest, resistance, and prophetic art created in response to social issues such as human trafficking and child soldiering. Thank you, everyone. Professor Al-Kati.
Thank you very much. This thing is on, I think. Thank you, those of you who've put this program together. You need to be commended because you're really trying to speak about the unspeakable in American life. So we only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to make some wild stops about some stuff that's on my mind about this question. And I'm going to start by saying we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's one of the children of the Magna Carta, which started this discussion about human freedom in the Western world, human rights, human dignity, and it's still going on. Martin Luther King thought that Jefferson's Declaration was the greatest socio-political document uttered, transcending the Magna Carta, that all men are created equal. All men, didn't say white men, said all men, which includes black men. He didn't say all Gentiles. It said all men, which includes Jews. Didn't say all Protestants. It said all men, which includes Catholics. Those words are still with us. And for the most part, they've been just words, And I think this is the source of everything we talk about is this contradiction between American ideals and pragmatic reality. And pragmatism wins all the time. This country makes Machiavelli look very, very good with its pragmatism. And that's what we are. So to talk about a question with respect to slavery and with respect to reparation, apologies, that kind of thing, we don't have the vocabulary yet to discuss it because we don't have any moral courage as a nation. The people who lead this nation, I wish you were Congress or somebody so they could hear me, you know, are moral cowards. I would say that to any Republican or any right-winger or anybody. You're a coward. They're morally. I don't mean you're a coward in other ways. I know you love to fight. I know that kind of stuff, that kind of coward. And in a way, that's cowardice too. But there it is before you. And all the forces of progress, and it's not just black people, but other forces who understand this and trying to make and create a better world, because the Declaration is there for us to do that. So I think it's very hard to discuss something like reparation. You know, that triggers whites just go mad, you know, when you say that. I mean, it's like it has nothing to do with reality. And you can talk about Jefferson and Washington, how virtuous they are, and Madison, who wrote the Constitution, and all of that. And we say that matter-of-factly. And if I say, well, what about slavery? I say, shut up. We don't discuss that. Yeah. But there they are. The founding fathers, no other country has a set of people like that. You know, they've made them demigods, the very thing that George Washington said we don't want to be. He said that over and over again about the Constitution was imperfect and so forth. But Americans insist on making them demigods, making them something other than men with faults. And they had some serious faults, you know. We can't even discuss stuff like something so obvious, the Jefferson-Sally Hemings affair. And I submit that she wasn't the only one he slept with. You know, that was a part of the makeup of this slaveholding class, is the black sub-wife. That was a part of the system. You see the evidence, you know, how black people look. Who do you think made those babies? Artificial insemination? I don't think so. You know, this is why we look like we look. Black people, some of whom are not very black. It's really something I want to say to you without talking about apologies and so forth. Incidentally, I just left. I was trying to, somebody help me with the man Gunther. He's a great novelist from Germany. Günter Grass, yeah. I just read an article about him. I've never read any of his works, but he was trying to deal with, he became the conscience of Germany, talking about the Holocaust. And coincidentally, I also heard a radio show with a Jewish person discussing the Holocaust. That's the only, and incidentally, next to that, I just heard the brilliant young black man who's the head of the African American National Museum we're trying to bring into being is have done. And it all, the Jewish man who's talking about the Jewish experience with the Holocaust in Germany, matter-of-factly mentioned, you know, that we have a Holocaust museum. I said, well, why don't we have a museum for slavery? He said that. You know. So, why isn't it? We don't have a memory of slavery. It's not in our imagination. What's wrong with black children? That's part of it. They don't have a historical imagination. When a white child goes to school, he sees George Washington. You know, it's in his historical imagination. But we don't see Crispus Attucks, who John Adams claimed was the foundation for American freedom at the Boston Massacre. They were there. They said he was a tall, woolly-haired Negro. You know, Tom Brokaw wasn't there. Katie Couric wasn't there. That's what John Adams said. On this day, March 5th, 1770, the foundation of American freedom was laid. They said, the contemporaries acknowledged those 5,000 black soldiers in the war. I mean, one of my relatives could have, this is literally true, I can't prove it, it could be true, that you know, one of George Washington's could have been his manservant. We're that close, black and white people, in reality. But the social distances is miles and miles apart. We can't think clearly. And then not enough of us are brave enough, as Gunther Grass indicated, that the people of Germany, not just the Nazi Party, just a handful of people who control the state. There wasn't a lot of them. But all it takes for evil to triumph is good men and women to stand idly by and do nothing. And that is in fact what is happening in America. Right now, our children are being re-enslaved before our very eyes, the prison industrial complex. We know that. You can see that. There were 300,000 people, a little more than 300,000 people in 1970 in prisons of all races. And that is slightly more than 2 million. And slightly more than half of them are black people. That's in slavery. We know that's it. And I think that the girl who wrote The New Jim Crow is absolutely right. It's been reconfigured, slavery. It exists. We are not a free people, black people, so long as we have people who've been so ostracized. They don't feel a part of this country. Why only, what is it, 19% of the people in Ferguson voted? It's not hard to explain. You know, why they're really not a part of America. And they don't see themselves as a part of America. And that population is growing. You know, somebody's going to try to exploit that when it gets to the real millions of black people who are in but not of American society. It's going on right now. And the moral cowards are not just begin and end in Congress, but it's you and I. Who can see this? Who know this? And then having the courage to say, no, I'm not going to participate in this. I'm going to say no to this. It's not just these ugly senators, whom they're ugly people to me. They are in their behavior and so forth. There's some awful people in the U.S. Congress. I would say it's not just them, it's you and I who are afraid to speak loud, Reverend. You know, tell the truth, shame the devil. So that's the problem. And whatever else is said here between you and I about what, that has to be said. And every chance I get, I'm going to say it. Every audience I speak to, I don't care about the complexity. You can be all black, all white, white on white, or whatever, mixed, or whatever. Look at that stupid stuff like race. There are people who know better. I'm not a race, and neither are you. It's a myth, and it's a rather modern myth. People have been going around the world calling themselves white until Chris got lost. Y'all know who Chris is. Nobody, there was no white man. There was no Negro. That's nonsense. There were no half-breeds. There were no mestizos. There were no Zambos. And we know this. This just happened since Chris got lost. It just happened. This political party with no name called White Man. That's what it is. It's a political party. There were no white men. I was just I'm doing some reading about England. These are my favorite white men I like to pick on, are Englishmen, Anglo-Saxon, because it's the centerpiece of this madness about white. Being white. You know, we were beating up the Scots and the Irish and so forth. The basic identity of human beings is their language, their geography. That's where we all come from. That's what makes a Scotsman and an Irishman, an Irishman. It's not color. We know this. You educated people know this who go to college. Most of us are not educated at all. I think Du Bois is right. The chief aim of education is to create a thinking human being. Greeks said it even better. Education is the science, the art and science of making human beings, of teaching one to be responsible to oneself, for oneself, and to others. That's what education is. You know, it's to create a thinking human being, not to create people who are well-trained in this skill or that skill and so forth. That's nonsense. These are roles that we play. You are a lawyer. That's not who you are, not literally. And you ought to know that. It's a role. I'm a half-baked teacher. You know, I know that. But I don't take that too seriously. But it's my humanity. I got to be honest with myself, honest with people I interact with, or try to be. And that's not easy, McGee, to be honest. That's not easy. It took me a long time to get where I am now. You know, it's been agonizing. So I'm going to say it because I believe it to be true. Not that it is true. I just think it's true. Truth has something to do with values. It's not like facts. With human values. And this is what I think is true. White supremacy, the doctrine which dominates this country, is an evil. It dehumanizes humanity. It declares itself against the human family. That's what white supremacy is. I'm saying not just black people, Native American, everywhere, and Native Americans, wherever it went, it's created misery for the human beings, wherever, not just in this country. Speaking of genocide, which I wasn't speaking of, isn't this amazing that we just talk about genocide since a Jewish experience, and it should be talked about. It wasn't even in our vocabulary until that Polish lawyer put it in our vocabulary, clan killing, over the Jewish experience. Well, that's an old experience in the modern world. The first example of genocide on a mass level is what happened to these indigenous peoples in this hemisphere. We can't count the number of them, but it's way beyond 6 million, let me assure you. That's the first act of genocide, and it didn't stop there. It was in Australia. You know, island next to Australia, there's not a single human being who was there indigenously is still there. And the people and the Arawaks and the Tanos who inhabited these islands that Africans inhabit now. You know, Columbus was the first leader of genocidal acts. And we know this. You know, there's maybe not a single Arawak left on the planet because he's been replaced by some Yoruba or Igbo like me. You know, after they wiped out the native populations in the islands, they replaced them with Africans. We know this. You know, we don't know how many people have been killed. And incidentally, Germans practiced genocide in what we call Namibia today in West Africa on the heels of World War I. The Herero people, there are very few of them left. It's the first acts in Africa. Now, Africans were too valuable. The reason why we're still here, really, it was African people, and by and large, were too valuable to the development of capitalism. That's why we weren't killed en masse, because we're the labor force which undergirded capitalism. I always say people who mystify why black people are here. Black people are mystified. Why are we here? One reason, and one reason alone. We were brought here to create wealth, to make other people rich. That's why my ancestors were brought here. That's not a mystery. We undergirded what we call capitalism. Why do you think America is so rich and so young? England is 800 years old. You outstripped everybody because of the free labor of black people. And we can't acknowledge that it stimulated the Industrial Revolution, American slavery. 90% of the gross national product came from the sweat and sinews of black people's body, right up until the Civil War. I didn't make this up. All economists know this. You know, most of the immigrants who were coming to this country in the 1830s and the 1840s, if you want to call them immigrants, 1840s were Africans, not Europeans, in this hemisphere. That's, you know, if we knew that, we would be better human beings, I think, if we could address that and go through the pain, because it's going to be painful to face this. You know, I've cried thinking about this. I'm stopped. I don't cry anymore. You know, you gotta get through it. You gotta get through it. Just like nothing can be faced that can't be, nothing can be solved that can't be faced, and you have to face this. That's what it's about. You know, whatever else is said, what you say, what I say, you gotta deal with that. The fundamental question of social justice is to treat Native people and African people fairly, at least as fairly as Europeans have been treated, who have more invested in this land and labor than Europeans. Now, I know that makes some people mad. I think that when some of these guys, you know, like what do you call them, the Rifle Association, whoever, are gearing up for, you know, when you hear people like me talk, I don't give a damn. I don't care what you think. I know what I think, and I think you're wrong. I think you're immoral for doing that. You know that's wrong to debase another human being. In the process, you're debasing yourself. And all you got is scared. There is an unnamed fear that governs human, it's people who call white. Let me get this clear. I do not dislike white people. In fact, I love white people. That might surprise you. I happen to love the truth even more, but I have nothing against humanity. I'm not against white people. I'm against what Frederick Douglass taught us to be against. I esteem myself to be a good, persistent hater of injustice and oppression. But my anger ceases when they cease. I have no heart to visit upon the children the sins of their fathers. Ain't about you. It's about deeds. The judgment is on the deed. It ain't how you look. It's what you do. And if you were black, I would feel the same way. And I have opposed black people, like some of these people in Africa, Sese Mobutu and those. I oppose them, you know, because he's wrong for treating human beings that way. And the people who call themselves white are wrong. You know, that's some nonsense about being white in the first place. You ought to stop that, you know. Being white is not a color. It's a state of mind. I could be white, like a lot of black people are, in their views and visions of the world. Look just like me, and has adopted those attitudes toward the world, beginning with their own people. That's what white supremacy has done. It's deformed humanity. Nobody can be different from the way you think. You're always right, always wrong. And another interesting thing about being an American and this race thing is how close it is to what Hitler did. Same idea. Race was central to the Nazi regime. Race, this myth that Hitler acknowledged. There's no scientific proof that there's race, but I need a conception to recast the world. They believe it, this myth, and the blonde beast, and all kind of crazy stuff, which had nothing to do with Hitler. He didn't invent that. He borrowed that and put it together. And one of the first place he looked when he was looking to build a Nazi regime is to American, the people who played with genes are getting rid of the inferiors, the people who were disabled and so forth. What do you call it? It's not eugenics. It began here. He borrowed from here. W.D. Griffin made the most racist movie ever, still stands, Birth of a Nation. He invited him to be his propaganda minister before Lena Riefenstahl. Hitler invited Americans. Think of what did he do with Negroes who never did harm to anybody? He made them a menace to American civilization. Think of what I can do with Jews. And he did it, and he used a film. The greatest propaganda instrument ever. Hitler used it. Anybody ever seen Triumph of the Will? You ought to see it. You ought to see Triumph of the Will. It's the greatest piece of propaganda ever, with the possible exception of Birth of a Nation. He used it. I'm getting the time thing. There's another thing between us and Europeans, that time thing. See, Africans don't believe in that. We make time. We create time. We think time is a neutral variable. It don't mean nothing. You make it. It's all right. It's okay. Yeah, but I want to say what I had to say. Now, it might not have anything to do with, my dear, what you wanted me to say, but I had to say it. Yeah, yeah.
I too would like to thank the law school for inviting me to be here today, and I'm honored to share the table with you and look forward to a conversation in just a little bit. But first, I want to shift gears to World War II. I first became aware of a critique of the seamlessness of Christian theology in an article about paintings by Samuel Bach, a contemporary social realist who is himself a survivor of the Holocaust. Samuel Bach is one of the 250 or so survivors from Vilna, a city in modern-day Lithuania that was liquidated by the Nazis in 1941. Among his memories of those unspeakable days is one of his friend Samek, who did not survive. Instead, Bach remembers his friend was lying left bleeding in a pool of his own blood. Eventually, his young friend would appear in Bach's works, taking the posture of the boy in the famous SS photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto. Present with allusions to these boys, too, though, are haunting self-portraits, raising more questions still about the randomness of survival, about memory and tragedy, and about the monstrous depths to which human beings can sink. In Sanctuary, for example, this painting on the screen now, he's using a palette of blues and greens and browns, and Bach provides an image here of uncreation. Trees and bushes conjure memories of Eden, a garden that once was lush but is no longer. In the distance, tree trunks are scorched, eliciting memories of those fires ever emblematic of death camps, but representing two fires other than these. Mountains climb in the distance, but storm clouds gather. Within this ominous setting is an altar of crumbling columns and bricks, of temples destroyed, of sanctuaries abandoned. Superimposed on the altar is the boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, faceless in the foreground, but emerging from behind with features Samek's, or are they Samuel's own, survivors and victims, entangled with an allusion to the crucifixion of Christ, the wounded hands bearing the imprints of nails, or are they bullet holes, present in both representations of the child. In the deserted sanctuary, God is implicated too in the destruction, ensnared with the rest in the foliage, bearing witness to a breaking of the treaty, to an unwriting of the covenant, to a severing of relationship. The painting pulls us onto religious ground where our questions are joined with Bach's own, none of them finding easy resolution, all of them faced finally by a silence only appropriate in the horrors that we create. And as much as I want that sentence to refer to the horrors we humans create, in this case it is we Christians who are largely implicated by this particular horror. In their article on Genesis, Genocide, and the Art of Samuel Bach, scholars Fuel and Phillips reference Jewish philosopher and rabbi Emil Fackenheim and his critique that a seamless reading of the Bible should no longer be possible after the Holocaust. Fackenheim observed the continuity of triumphalism and supersessionism in Catholic theological discourse, Christian theological discourse too more broadly, saying that much Christian theology and biblical exegesis have proceeded seamlessly. They have not been sufficiently interrupted by the reality of Jewish suffering. As a Catholic theologian myself, but as one who has studied abroad as an undergraduate at the University of Haifa in Israel, with Jewish historians, philosophers, linguists, and archaeologists, I am sympathetic to Fackenheim's claim. Many Catholic theologians and biblical scholars might take issue with the broadness of his view, and could do so by pointing to events like Vatican II that were called in part to address theological concerns in light of the Shoah. Documents like Nostra Aetate and Lumen Gentium were produced to speak to how the Catholic ought to understand oneself in relation to one's Jewish brothers and sisters, who, in the words of Lumen Gentium, remain most dear to God. Nevertheless, I cringe when I hear some of the gospel texts proclaimed at church with their depiction of Pharisees and Sadducees and Jews more broadly, going without comment from the pulpit. I'm meeting too many incoming students who believe that only baptized Christians can attain to salvation, and I'm attentive to a movement within Catholic theological circles that has considered words like change, discontinuity, and rupture with the past as deeply problematic. But it is a rupture with the past that another seamless garment, that of the Catholic ethic of life, dictates. In the minutes that I have today, I want to support this assertion by sketching the theological contours that gave rise to the anti-Semitism of Hitler and of Hitler's willing executioners, with brief stops, and given the time constraints, they must be brief, in the 1st century, the Middle Ages, and the period of the Reformation, in order to see how incremental developments, none of them inevitable, made this catastrophe, even the final solution, plausible. Moreover, these incremental developments indicate that a seamless garment of continuity within a Christian theological past is, as Fackenheim pointed out, deadly. Rather than protecting life, this theological seamless garment actually threatens life. Thus, I will argue that if Catholics want to protect our other seamless garment, our consistent ethic of life, we must be interrupted by the Shoah, as German Catholic theologian Johannes Baptist Metz recognized years ago. We must insist on the protection, too, of Jewish life by attending to the theological underpinnings that contributed to the occurrence of the Holocaust in the first place, and in a more thorough manner than in the way represented by Vatican II. In order to trace the most basic outline of the development of Christian anti-Semitism, let us begin in the 1st century. In the frame of only a few decades, as the followers of Jesus, who were themselves Jewish, opened the community to Gentiles, and as the community already sectarian in nature further divided over the question of whether Jesus was the Messiah or even a Messiah, the Gospels can be read to document the understandable and increasingly hostile contest within the community between those who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah and those who did. In the beginning, then, this needs to be understood as an intra-religious dispute, not a conflict between religions already separate from one another. By the end of the 1st century, after Rome had destroyed the Jewish temple, thereby prompting the Jewish community to tighten its self-definition, such that the followers of Jesus were no longer thought to be properly Jewish, the author of the Gospel of John pejoratively calls the Pharisees children of the devil. And Matthew, too, includes the fateful line that his blood be on us and on our children. In an architecture of an apology, then, priests and pastors cannot let these lines simply go without comment. They must indicate that the polemic included in these lines is probably not dated to the time of Jesus himself, but represents the increasing tension in the community as each gospel writer put his quill to papyrus. The polemic against Judaism continued and increased in virulence during the Christian Middle Ages. My doctoral work entailed examination of scores of biblical commentaries written between the 4th and 14th centuries. In order to understand the kind of interpretation that had become representative of medieval Christian exegesis, we must consider a figure like Rabanus Maurus, a celebrated 9th century German monk and theologian, one of the most prominent Christian teachers of the Carolingian age. His commentary on Esther demonstrates the kind of anti-Jewish sentiment that had by then thoroughly overtaken the Christian imagination. Contemporary biblical scholars recognize that Esther is a novella in the Hebrew Bible, set during the period of the Babylonian exile and restoration under Cyrus. The story demonstrates the vulnerable yet complex fate of the Jews under exilic circumstances. In the story, Esther was Jewish by birth, but her ethnic background was hidden from the king when he chose her among his harem to become his wife. When Esther's uncle Mordecai refused to pay homage before Haman, one of the king's officers, Haman called for the destruction of the Jewish people. He built the gallows upon which they would hang for sedition. As a result, however, and without invitation, a violation for which she too could be hung, Esther approached the king and at a banquet later requested that he lift the impending massacre of her people. When the king learned from Esther of Haman's plot, the king ordered that Haman himself be hung on the gallows that he had constructed for Mordecai and his people. In Judaism, the event is commemorated annually on Purim, but in Rabanus Morris's medieval Christian gloss on the text, using an allegorical framework that understood all Hebrew texts to foreshadow the covenant in Christ, he interpreted that just as Esther approached the king to intercede on behalf of the Jewish people, so does the Virgin Mary approach Christ to intercede on behalf of the Christian people. Esther, in other words, functioned as a type for the Virgin Mary. In a shocking turn, the gallows upon which Haman was hung as the enemy of the Jews were reserved in the mind of Rabanus Morris for the enemies of Christ, who, in his gloss, were none other than the Jews themselves. In Christian art from this period, Jews in their synagogues are shown blindfolded and persecuted, sadly an instance of art imitating life. During the period of the Reformation, then, Luther's well-known anti-Jewish rhetoric is merely in keeping with his Catholicism. As Luther and subsequent generations redefined the doctrines of Christ's sin and salvation in a Protestant frame, however, theological anthropology developed in a way for the Protestants that resulted in the further dehumanization of the Jews. In the Book of Concord, the primary compendium of Lutheran doctrine, original sin is defined as destroying the goodness in human nature. Lutherans confess with the formula of Concord to this day that, and as I'm reading, note the implications of these words on Jews. Quote, original sin in human nature is not only a total lack of good in spiritual divine things, but it replaces the lost image of God in man with a deep, wicked, abominable, bottomless, inscrutable, and inexpressible corruption of his entire nature in all of its powers, especially of the highest and foremost powers of the soul in mind, heart, and will. As a result, since the fall, man inherits an inborn wicked stamp, an interior uncleanness of heart, and evil desires and inclinations. By nature, every one of us inherits from Adam a heart that is by nature diametrically opposed to God and his highest commands, and is actually enmity against God. Unquote. Scholars have recognized that embedded in this theological anthropology is a form of dehumanization that has provided fertile ground for genocide. Arguably, just as soldiers are trained to kill the enemy and just as Rwandans killed cockroaches, so did Christians participate in the killing of the Jews, the enemies of Christ, who were not among the recipients of baptismal graces that overcame the impact of original sin. Jews were therefore thought to have been of lesser value and as such entirely expendable. When this thinking met with the modern creation of racial categories and the Nazi belief that the Aryan race was superior to all others, the result was calamitous. It is worth noting that 67% of Germans were Lutheran in 1933, until Germany annexed Austria and became about 54% Lutheran and 40% Catholic by 1939. Neither church developed a sufficient theological rationale to resist Hitler, and the majority within both churches, both Protestant and Catholic, became Hitler's willing executioners, whether literally or by complicity in what their fellow countrymen and women were doing, although there were, of course, exceptions in both theological camps. In terms, then, of building some kind of an architecture of an apology, I want to turn to South Africa. During that country's truth and reconciliation process, grounded in a philosophy of Ubuntu, and understanding that we are human through each other, South Africans demonstrated a way forward that applies to the problems before us. In South Africa, the issue of forgiveness was divorced from the issue of reconciliation. Through the process of hearing the truth in possible exchange for amnesty, at least in the telling of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, Black South Africans largely forgave white South Africans for the atrocities committed against them because they recognized their interconnectedness. They knew that a failure to forgive would only escalate the cycle of violence and make the entire community less safe. However, unlike in the West, where forgiveness is too often associated with a forgetfulness that is impossible at best and dangerous at worst, and unlike in the West, where forgiveness is associated too often with an immediate and confused notion of reconciliation, forgiveness is understood in South Africa as a spiritual discipline, as a spiritual practice. To hear Jesus say that I must forgive my neighbor 70 times 7 times means, in much South African and liberation understandings of theology, that I am called to forgive the same violation over and over and over again, even 70 times 7 times. When anger and hurt and resentment bubble up within me, I practice forgiveness. This is for my own well-being, for my own empowerment, for my own welfare. It is not to hand the power of forgiveness over to the wrongdoer in want of an apology that may never come. Forgiveness does not require an apology. Forgiveness is a gift to oneself precisely so that one does not become like one's enemy, and it certainly does not constitute reconciliation. In South Africa, reconciliation is understood as distinct from forgiveness. Reconciliation is understood in the liberation framework of Tutu as the mending of a relationship through the long, hard, arduous work of reestablishing trust between the one who has been violated and the one who has done the violating. Not only does reconciliation require an apology then, with sincere contrition and confession of sin, but also, and here I'm inserting Catholic theological sacramental language intentionally, penance or works of mercy, the real work in the architecture of an apology, which ultimately can serve to restore a community of trust by establishing anew just and loving relations of shalom and chesed, to borrow Hebrew theological language. Thus, in the political context before us, reconciliation requires reparation. It requires restitution. In relation to the Shoah, then, and informed by these insights from South Africa, the architecture of an apology entails Christian contrition, or true sorrow, for the role of Christian faith and theology in the murder of 6 million Jews and all of their descendants. The architecture of an apology entails Christian confession of sin and sincere acknowledgement of how the Christian tradition has contributed to make Jewish life vulnerable to the pogroms that have erupted in its wake. My Catholic hearers will surely recognize that absolution comes next, the offer of God's forgiveness, which in this political framework before us today lies also in the hands and hearts of our Jewish brothers and sisters, before whom all Christians, not just our popes and our leaders, must repent, even in dust and ashes, and probably more than 70 times 7 times. Forgive us. Please forgive us. And finally, an architecture of an apology requires restitution, including evidence of ongoing Christian theological work, even in the creation of a seam with its past, so that that which is problematic in Christian theology more broadly, and in Catholic theology in particular, is abandoned, indeed ruptured, so that a deeper, richer, more life-affirming theology can be upheld, becoming a garment that can be trusted to protect all life, both born and unborn, and certainly inclusive of Jewish life in the contemporary world. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. El-Kati and Dr.
Well put,
Redney.
well put.
At this time, I think that we're going to allow the responses. So if there are any remarks or questions that the two of you have for each other, we'll use that time. And Sean and Professor Schultz are walking around the room. If any of you have questions or comments, they'll be handing out and then collecting those green cards. Please join me in thanking our two speakers again. Thank you so much.
Well put. I don't think it could be said better. Oh, is my mic on or is it off? No, I don't.
I think it's on.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I've never heard a dissertation quite like that. Yeah, it was good, very, very human. I wish we could advance that, outside of academic circles, outside of theological circles. This is a very secular society, and although we call ourselves religious, and that's really just going through the motion. I don't consider Americans, in the generality, Christians. I think, you know, wherever human beings have existed in some organized fashion as a society, have had a God or a higher power overriding omnipresence of something over their lives to which they owe their highest loyalty. And you call it by the gods that we are familiar with, the organized religions of, you know, Yahweh and Jesus and Allah and that sort of thing. We know that in America, religion is so, in ways, Muslims are a lot more honest. It's so mixed with their nationalism and their ideas of race. You know, that in a way, in America, race, that ideology supersedes the faith that they claim. It spoils every virtue that we claim is race and racism. This whole thing about hierarchy of people, you know, their gods have given this God whites all the virtues and blacks or Native Americans all the vices, that kind of thing. That's really an insult to human intelligence, but it goes on. People leave it and it's mixed in with your emotional life. It's so complex, this race thing. It does not surprise me that the killing field is going on right now. They've always, you know, with cops killing black people, matter of factly, like you killing. You couldn't do that to an animal, like black people are being killed, you know. There's a kind of a rage, a kind of a mixture of fear and anger and whatever that is that goes inside of, end quote, being white. But you really don't have to do anything to me. Your presence inspires a kind of anger and violence. Let me tell you a little story. These are the stories that black people should tell. We don't do much. I just started doing this myself, you know, recapping my life in racism. You may not believe this, but you know, the N word, now we can't say that, now that's phony, but let's where, you know, after a certain period of time, after I was about 9 years old, it was like, you said it every day out of the white politician's mouth, you know. But the first time I became aware of the word nigger, where it registered with me, was from a 4-year-old child, white girl. This is in the South. Her mother was encouraging her as I'm walking down the sidewalk. And I heard him whispering, say, "Go ahead, say it." And as I was walking past the house, a little girl came down. I will never forget this. And said, "Nigger, nigger, nigger, nigger." I wasn't sure what that meant. Well, I didn't know quite what it meant. But I know it terrorized me for some reason, you know, all the way down the block. Now, I'm sure I heard black people say that word by the time I was 9, but it never registered in that way. People have their own way of explaining and countering this thing of being the object of hatred. Now I know, you know, with a little bit of maturity, the little girl didn't know what she was saying. That was ideology. It's a mother teaching her that. And there was nothing wrong with that. That was normative. That's normative. That's what makes America a racist society. So I don't take many, and I've met white people whom I believe were Christians. But they're very far. I've met a guy, we were about the same age, who was a young priest. We were in the early 30s, who snatched that collar off his neck over the question of justice in America. Yeah, I can't stand this stuff. It's too violent a contradiction. Young white man, I can't be this kind of Christian. And this uniform that I'm wearing is phony. Right in front of me. We were at at a restaurant, a quiet restaurant, having our chats. He just said, it's too much. You know, can't be Christian or Catholic. That's phony. Because the whole thing is about race.
Thank you, Dr. El-Kati. I feel like you've charmed the entire room, and we all could listen to you speak forever. But there are no, it's really wonderful. I just want to make sure that at least some of these questions can get addressed. Dr. Vredny, the first question that we have here is for you. I know that towards the end of your speak, you were saying that forgiveness doesn't require an apology, and that it's not the same as reconciliation. So the first question that one of the people in the audience has asked is, how do you forgive someone or a group of people who don't think that they have done anything wrong?
That's a great question, and I too want to thank you for being at the table and for having the courage to say the things that you have said to us today. I think we need to hear it more broadly than in this room. There's several things I want to say in response to Dr. El-Kati, but I think in terms of forgiveness, this is absolutely not a framework that I was raised understanding. I very much kept waiting for apologies and kept thinking that in terms of a relationship of forgiveness, I needed to apologize to someone else. It wasn't until I really met theologians in South Africa that I was introduced to a different way of thinking about this. And so that's the first thing I think that I really need to clarify. I think that all of these concepts are enculturated. So in South Africa, no one is telling folks who were on the receiving end of the injustices of apartheid law, no one is saying to them, you must forgive the whites. I mean, that would be horrendous. But culturally, South Africans seem to have, black South Africans seem to have some sort of an encultured, and I think it's through this philosophy of Ubuntu, to recognize that forgiveness is for the empowerment of one's own self. That if I continually were to wait, if I were a black South African, and if I were continually to wait for the whites to apologize, I would be continually handing over the power of my own psyche to the white person who most likely is not going to apologize. I mean, we've had 20 years. There have been some, but it hasn't been widespread. And there's certainly not been a great deal of effort towards reparation and restitution. So the encultured idea is, I forgive without an apology because I am no longer going to allow that person to have power over me. Do you see? It's a breaking of the power relationship to say that I'm in charge of my own well-being and I'm not going to hand that over to someone else. And so you do it as a spiritual practice in terms of how Desmond Tutu is speaking of it. You will become angry. The resentment will bubble up within you. That's natural. It's normal. It doesn't make you evil. But when it happens, you become the one in control of how you respond to that in the world. And you can become violent and filled with vengeance and continue the cycle of violence. Or you can say it ends here, and I'm going to not respond to you in the way that you have treated me in order to upend the cycle and to set a new future into place. So that's my
Could you say just response. A little more about Ubuntu?
Yeah. May I?
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Vredny. Everyone, you all had really amazing questions, but unfortunately there is a class outside that wants to come in. So thank you so much, and thank you so much, everybody, for attending.
Yeah, that was a great, I wanted you to articulate that. Thank you, because that's a great